I'm asking the questions here.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and we are back together again for another episode in our Biblical Theology project. Today, we are planning to talk about Deuteronomy 24, 25, and 26. And as always, we've got the regular team here. Let's go ahead and bring in Brother Greg. Greg, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Joe?
Doing pretty well. We're doing
Good.
pretty well. So, you got anything big in your plans coming up soon?
Well, yeah, I'm actually 2 days from now. I'm leaving for Guatemala for a couple weeks, and so fortunately, we've bankrolled enough episodes that there should be no interruption in the flow, but I will be leaving snowy West Michigan for someplace a little more tropical. So
yeah, well,
that's excited about that.
By the time this episode is published, yeah,
I'll
you'll be back.
Yeah.
So how was your trip?
It was fantastic. No, it was good. I'm looking forward to it. I always enjoy going down there and serving with those brothers and sisters in Christ, and so sounds like we're going to be doing. This isn't a normal trip down there, but we're going down there to just work. And so I guess we're going to be running some wires and doing some woodwork and maybe chopping some wood. So,
and your normal trips, you don't like to do any work?
What's that?
You said this won't be a normal trip. You're going to be doing work on this one. Normal trips, you don't do any work? Or?
Well, normally trips down there aren't the typical, North Americans come down and fix something or do something. And so this is just us, me and a buddy, going down to just do work for a couple weeks. 2 weeks.
Well, we'll miss you, but again, the viewers won't, but I personally will miss you. Your family will miss you, of course, but have a great time, and we look forward to hearing about how it went when you actually come back. But
appreciate it.
Bless you. And Brother Micah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We had a good weekend here at RBC Lunaway. We actually celebrated our 40th anniversary as a church this past weekend. So we had a guest speaker, and we had a couple of sessions of preaching on the doctrine of last things. And on Saturday, we had a banquet on Friday night, and our guest speaker preached God's word for us on Sunday morning. And then I preached in the afternoon and brought us to the Lord's table. So it was a good weekend.
Sounds like an exciting celebration, and I know that's Greg's favorite topic, the doctrine of last things. So surprised he didn't drive over there to celebrate with you guys.
If I had only known.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to have you as well, and let's bring in the last member of our team, last but certainly not least, Brother Eric. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I don't know that I can compete with Micah and Greg, but I'm doing very well, all things considered, and looking forward to...
Nobody expects you to, brother.
No, it's...
No trips coming up, no major milestones to celebrate, but still excited, I'm sure, about God's Word, if I know you at all.
I mean, that goes without saying. Our viewers by now should just expect that, so I don't even need to say it.
Yeah, right on. Well, it is good to see you all and to talk about these things. And so why don't we get right to it? Again, just a quick note for you, if maybe this is your first time watching our show, we're talking about Deuteronomy 24, 25, and 26. We won't read all of those chapters here during the episode, but if you haven't read those, we would encourage you to maybe press pause and actually read through them, because we won't be able to talk about every single detail and every single nuance, but we will be hitting kind of the things that stand out to us. And so any of you guys want to get us started today with something from our chapters?
Yeah, I'll start with a question from verses 1 through 4 in Deuteronomy 24. Those verses seem to teach, at least on the surface, that a man who divorces his wife cannot marry her again after she marries another man. So my question is, what exactly is the reason for this? Why can't a man remarry his wife who he has divorced?
Yeah, so to me, it seems like it has to do with the circumstances that surrounded the at least the first divorce. If you look carefully at verse 1, it says that he has found some indecency in her. Now, this obviously wasn't like substantiated adultery or something, because we know what the penalty for that would be. But it was something that was at least considered by their society to be worthy of divorce. And what the commentaries that I read say is that this language actually indicates that it was something serious enough, or at least the claim was something serious enough, to where he would have been entitled to keep her dowry or bride price. He would have been entitled to keep that because there were grounds for divorce on her end, or at least that's what the claim was. And then, so if that's the case, if you're charging her with something where you are now going to financially benefit from this divorce, well, she goes out and marries somebody else, and then that person hates her. Same words aren't used there, by the way. It's not that he finds some indecency in her. It says if he hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife. The implication there is that I think the implication is that she retains that dowry under those circumstances. Obviously, if her husband dies, she's not going to lose that money. Under those circumstances where you charged your former wife with something, some evil or something that substantiated the divorce where you financially benefited, then she goes out and marries somebody else, and there's another dowry involved, and then they end up divorced or that person dies, you're not allowed to marry her again, because the implication, I think, is that you'd be marrying her to exploit her for financial gain. I think that's what's going on in these passages. It's limiting the exploitation of the woman under those circumstances.
Yeah, I suppose that's all a possibility. A lot of that would have to go without saying here, which I think is a bit odd. Now, as I read the text, I'm working with the presupposition that the only legitimate grounds for divorce, and therefore the only grounds for divorce that would have been practiced by these people, was in the case of adultery. And so when I read of this indecency, I guess I just assumed it was euphemistic language for the one and only reason they were allowed to do this. Maybe that's not the case.
Wouldn't she be put to death then?
She should have been.
So
again,
that's why I think this is making allowance for something that isn't necessarily ideal, but was part of the practice.
Well, no matter what the case, we have someone somewhere in this chain not doing exactly what the law would have prescribed, right? Like the only provision for divorce was infidelity.
Not according to this verse, I don't think.
Well, again, that depends upon how you read this verse. Right?
There's a difference between what the law of Moses allowed for under the certain circumstances and what the ideal was according to God's moral law that Jesus repeats, I think.
All right. So let me just bypass all. Maybe you're all right. I don't get any sense from this that it's about exploitation for financial gains. Like that doesn't. That's nowhere in the text. Now, if some scholar somewhere found something that says that's the case, maybe that's the case. It seems like, for whatever reason, some indecency, as the NASB classifies it, man sends out his wife, she marries some other, for similar reasons, the same reasons, I have no idea. She can't go back. It's an abomination before the Lord. And so, again, I think when something's said to be an abomination before the Lord, we have to take that very seriously. Does it put it into the realm of quote unquote moral law? We'd have to discuss that. But I think this breaks some foundational principle tied back to God's divinity. And if that's because of financial exploitation, boy, it would have been nice if that said that in the text.
Yeah, I think that that's the implication, and I think that's why it makes it an abomination, because
so this woman's going to come up with 3 dowries like that. Like again, was that the normal practice? No,
it's so this person in her first marriage, there would have been a dowry from her father or whomever. That would have been their possession as a married couple. When the divorce happened, if there were grounds for the divorce, now. Grounds according to them, right? I know, like, maybe that's not grounds according to God's moral law, but grounds according to them that they were making allowances for. Just like there's allowances for all sorts of stuff in the Old Testament law. There's allowances for polygamy. There's allowances for forms of, well, slavery's a harder one to talk about. But if there were grounds for it, then he would have been able to keep that and benefit financially from it. Just like
I understand.
Just like the offended party should nowadays be awarded some sort of compensation too. The implication is that, or the second marriage doesn't end under those circumstances. It can end with him hating her. It doesn't say indecency under those circumstances, or him dying. So the idea is that there's different circumstances surrounding these separations, And now, under these circumstances, the first husband cannot go back. And I think that's like
in your original explanation. Maybe I misunderstood you. In your original explanation, you were talking about a dowry for the first husband, a dowry for the second husband, a dowry for the third husband. And I guess I just have no knowledge of this triple dowry or unlimited dowry thing. So for me, as I read the text, your interpretation brings in a lot of things, financial gain and money and dowry systems and how they work, that aren't talked about at all. And so I just find that an interesting hermeneutic, and probably one that I wouldn't want to embrace because it says absolutely nothing about that. But it could be the case.
I've never heard any of that, Micah. So that was interesting. I don't subscribe to that view, but I certainly think it's possible. But Greg, I'm with you. I think it would say that more explicitly if that's what was going on here. But I'm not completely closed to the idea that the historical, and we've talked about this before, we didn't grow up in this culture. So when you're reading this law completely independent of actually living in the culture without knowing all the practices, it might be more obvious to them as they're reading this that that's why. I would ask, though, a related question. I'd be curious because, like I said, I've never heard it explained for this reason. I have a different interpretation of this. But if the people got divorced the first time, there was some indecency and they censored them away, would they not be able to be reconciled? To me, the issue is not about the circumstances surrounding the divorce and then the second divorce and the nuance between, indecency and he hates her or if he dies. But the fact that she got remarried is the part that's interesting to me. So like if he charged her with something, but then wanted to take her back, but she didn't get remarried, would that also be outlawed by a law like this? Because it seems to me that the remarriage subsequent, that's the thing that's explicitly being stated. And that's the part that at least is most significant in my interpretation of it.
I think that the reconciliation would have been possible under my view. And you said you've never heard it explained that way. Actually, that's the only way I've ever heard it explained. So that's strange.
That's why it's interesting to have these conversations.
I've never heard it that way either. So,
well, how many sermon series have you guys heard on Deuteronomy 24?
That's
not
true,
that many.
Calvin preached through Deuteronomy right when we came to RBC.
Well, are you guys reading the same commentaries?
Well, probably not actually, but I know he usually uses different guys than I do, but all the commentaries that I checked kind of supported it. But
sometimes when you run in the same circles, you read the same commentaries and preach the same stuff.
They footnote each other if you go and look like.
So I think that reconciliation would have been possible before the second marriage. I think that according to my view, or according to the view that I've just commonly heard, I guess, what makes reconciliation impossible is because in the second marriage, there would have been, like, upon the dissolution of that marriage as well, there would have been more financial incentive for the first husband to say, hey, she's got something else from this other marriage now. So now I'm going to take her as my wife. And now I'm going to basically get what she has all over again. That seems to be, the second marriage is significant. I'm not saying the second marriage is insignificant. I think the second marriage is where a lot of it hinges. The circumstances behind both of the endings of the marriages matter. The second marriage is when it becomes, I think, impossible for him to get her back, basically.
Well, I think that seems to be playing on its face. So my only question is, man, that's what you just laid out. Completely agree with. I think that's what it says. Just all the reasoning behind it, all the justification behind this, it just seems odd to me that so much is built upon something that's completely unsaid. And as Joe said, like maybe this would have been perfectly clear to them. I just can't hold it because you have to build that tower off of some presumptions of what's going on. Like I want to ask the question: if a young woman, if her father paid a dowry to a first husband and that marriage dissolved, was there an expectation that a second dowry was going to the next husband? Like, we're just assuming that's the case. I have no idea that that's the case. Would there be a third? Like, I have no idea if any of those things are, but all of that is presumed in your hermeneutic.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know. I think it's at least possible that, okay, so like, let's say the second husband dies, even if it's not a dowry situation. Oftentimes she is going to be like, she's going to have, she's either going to be in charge of or have, so the things that the things that he owned. So
And yeah,
so like there still could be financial,
or they've gone to a child, right? Like
yeah.
maybe,
still
but
would
none
be
of
financial-
those things are addressed there. And so
Yeah.
I would just want to deal with what does the text say, not
Yeah. I
is
mean,
it
if you're
possible
but
that
if the goal is to try to give an answer to the why, which I think that wasn't that the question. I mean,
It was.
If you ask me, like, how sure are you about this in comparison with so many other things in Scripture? Like, the answer is I'm about like a 3 out of 10. Okay, but if you're trying to give a tentative why, that's what I'm trying to do.
Fair enough. Well, let me provide an alternative, which I think is all at least contained within the text. It doesn't mean that would be more agreeable or whatever. But if we go back to earlier on in Genesis, of course, we learned about this one flesh principle that God intended for a man and a woman to leave their father and mother, be joined together, and be one flesh. I think that there's a spiritual principle that is being embraced there. And here now in Deuteronomy 24, it's talking about if there is a material or a mechanistic separating of these things, what God has done is still there. And so now remarriage is the issue. I don't take the economics into it, although that might apply. That might be something that's going on. But the spiritual principle, she was joined to one man. Now she's joined to another man. And that's why I think that I would kind of center in or hone in on a different phrase. It's not about the difference of, well, if he hates her, but even if he dies, we would all agree, I think, that if someone is married and then they die, that bond to that person is dissolved. But even in this case, even if that second husband dies, because she's been joined to one husband, now she's been joined to another, it says that she is defiled to him. And so I think that we're getting a deeper spiritual understanding of what is going on in this union between a man and a woman. It's not just some social contract. There is a deeper principle. It is the means, of course, by which God chooses to create more human beings made in the image of God. So this is a spiritual thing, and it is a creative thing, and the union can't just be dissolved. Now, they can make different arrangements, but if she can't be then rejoined, even if this second husband dies, because to use biblical language, and they bristle at this, but she's in some sense to him become adulterated, and that they wouldn't be pure anymore to be joined together again. And so that's what I think is going on here. And I do think that, of course, like all of you, you was already alluded to, the New Testament does kind of, I think, make these principles a little bit clearer, but I think that's why the language is explained here this way. And if it was about economics, we're going to see some other economic things in here. I think God would talk about that, but her being defiled to him because of a second marriage, I think, is hinting at the fact that most people, part of this question is this still relevant today? Most people don't really understand what marriage is. Like they enter into it very casually and they think it's just a contract. It is much more than a contract. There is a bonding together of the man and the woman into one flesh in the eyes of God that is something that cannot simply be, undone because we get some annulment or we get some contract in the courts or whatever, or even just living in separate houses or sleeping in separate beds or whatever else. This union between a man and a woman can't be dissolved, and if she marries another one, it's not even dissolved by the death of the second husband, which is, again, very significant to me.
So would you say then that that interpretation seems to imply that this would extend even into the new covenant then, just because it's grounded in the very
You're asking
nature.
the question that is my next question that I'd like to ask.
I forgot that was on the show sheet, man.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No. Let me just ask it. I want to move beyond the why of it and say, like, in past episodes, I've laid my cards out on the table and said that I think when we read that something is an abomination to the Lord, that isn't that should be considered beyond our normal buckets of this type of law, and so yeah, that's my question: is what's being said here, because it's an abomination to the Lord, something that is still in place today? That if I were to marry a woman, to leave her for whatever reason, she were to marry another, and then that guy die, could I not remarry her because it's an abomination to the Lord?
Yeah, to ask even the question maybe a little bit differently, with the view that Joe just expressed.
I'm asking the questions here.
I want to add my nuance into it. With the view that Joe just expressed, let's say, I were to have like a first marriage or something. We're both unbelievers. Neither of us is saved at the time. We go on to marry other people. Spouses die. We're saved later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And we like reconnect, begin speaking to one another again, marry in the Lord. Is that totally outlawed by this? Because I think we agree that it's an abomination. I think the issue is, why is it an abomination? Is it an abomination because it's inherently
as long
sinful?
as you don't financially gain, it's good? Is that where your position's coming from?
Is it an abomination because this whole situation was the type of situation whereby someone was trying to exploit the weaker sex? Or so in other words, does it come down to thou shalt not steal? Or is it some way in relationship to thou shalt not commit adultery?
Yeah,
or something
now your view makes sense. Like, I can understand why if we're trying to justify or we're trying to sanctify a practice happening in the new covenant, we would want to make this more about exploitation and stealing.
I'm not trying to justify or sanctify anything. That's
no. I'm not saying you are. I'm saying
your
your position. The position you've said that the scholars that you've read, they espouse that it's about exploitation and financial gain. If you then had to turn around and talk about this, what Bill and Sally down the street are doing as Christians and members of our church, that explanation of these verses get you out of some hot water, or at least get you out of the hot seat for having to say whether or not this is still.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to assign motive though.
You're saying it makes sense. I'm not saying that's why they did it. I'm saying I understand, because when I read the text, it doesn't say anything about that. So why are we importing those ideas to this law? That makes sense why you'd be importing those ideas. If that's what I'm not saying that's why they did it, but it makes sense.
Or perhaps there are well-founded historical context reasons to assume that this is what they're talking about here. So maybe they're just trying to justify some practice that's going on.
Yeah, maybe there are triple dowries going on. I have no idea.
This law could very easily be exploited. Think of how easily you could exploit fornication, right? I mean, especially if you have, like, it's easy to get married, it's easy to get divorced. I like her today, I'm married, she likes this guy tomorrow, okay, they get married, then they get divorced, now she marries me again, and it just goes back around and round and round in circles. I think that the principle that's here is something that we've seen all throughout. God is holy, he expects faithfulness, and so, the principle is, if you're going to enter into marriage, take it very, very seriously. I think if you read carefully this text, as well as anything that's coming, which we'll talk about when we get there, divorce seems to be the product of, when things go wrong, it's bad. A lot of people say divorce is a sin. I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure that this says divorce is a sin. There's certainly an allowance for it. But remarriage is the part where it seems like that's usually where you start to get the strongest language. And so my recommendation for anybody who wants to be as holy and pure before the Lord, this is a very unpopular teaching, but if you get married and it doesn't work out and you end up getting divorced, you should really, really strongly consider remaining single or trying to be reconciled to that person. And if they marry somebody else, the ship has sailed, so to speak, for reconciliation, and probably remaining single is the best that you can do. Now, there's all sorts of other things. Micah, you gave a hypothetical scenario. There might be later texts that will kind of, explain that better than this certainly would. But, Greg, your question, does this still apply today? This spiritual principle, this joining together, again, there is no more powerful force on earth. Earthquakes, volcanoes, all these other things, they're destructive. There is no more powerful creative force than to be able to create new human beings made in the image of God. This is a powerful, powerful, powerful union. And people treat it like it's just some social contract and some other thing, like it's a business arrangement or something. Like you can just enter into it, get out of it, get back into it later. I don't think that that's what's being described. So I do think that there's a principle here that still remains for today. I've seen people that think that they should leave their current spouse because they got to go be reconciled to their first, and this is saying, no, don't do that. That person is defiled to you. If you are married now, even if you've had some stuff in the past, remain faithful to that person now. But Eric, we haven't heard your interpretation of this. There's two questions now on the table. Any thoughts from you?
Well, I don't know for sure what the answer is. But I will say, in Micah's defense, there are several things at least to consider. The first thing is when it says he found some indecency in her, that's almost certainly not talking about adultery. If it was talking about adultery, it would almost certainly say it, and the woman would have been put to death. The second thing is that elsewhere in Scripture, exploiting the poor or exploiting anyone in need is referred to as an abomination. So abominations are not only, like idolatry and things like that, but even exploiting the poor is referred to as an abomination. We also know elsewhere in Scripture, and I'm not going to go into detail, but that this law was specifically for the benefit of the woman. I mean, does it go beyond that? Of course it does. But it seems to me, as I read other texts, that this was for the protection of the woman. Now, the text does say, that it does make it sound like she can't return to her first husband because of the marriage of the second.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry, just based on what you're talking about right now. Yeah. If you got more, I'm interested in the rest. But based on everything we've read before, if the intention is to not exploit the economically viable or vulnerable, I suppose, wouldn't it be more advantageous for her to get married again in this culture and society? Or is that, maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought that being married was probably better for most women.
Perhaps, but not to the first guy. Like he already showed that he's going to put her away for some reason that does not seem to have been adultery. So maybe being married in general would have been better for her, but if he already showed himself to be a scoundrel who was trying to exploit her in the first place, then...
Well, it doesn't say it was him. It says he found it in her.
Well, whatever the case, the issue is that the main issue seems to be the text does not actually say that she can't, after her second husband dies, can't marry somebody else. It just says she can't marry her first husband. Marrying
Which
again,
to me makes it just seem like the economics. Even if a dowry is involved, she's got to pay it to somebody. I suppose
she has been defiled, and that is in the text, verse 4. The former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her to be his wife, since she has been defiled.
Yeah, to him, I think is
I agree to him, but because of the language of her being defiled, I find it hard to flip this on its head and, this is about the husband not exploiting his former wife, right? Like
remember, defiling in the old, something being defiled in the old covenant is not an inherently moral indictment. You could be defiled through an omission. You could be defiled through all sorts of stuff. It simply means that there's now a barrier that you can't cross. That's all that it means. So she's
Eric,
defiled.
I apologize. I wasn't trying to cut you off.
No, it's okay. By the way, Micah's interpretation is very common. You guys said you hadn't heard it before. This is one of the most common interpretations out there from the things that I've read. The sources.
I got to read more commentaries.
So,
or somebody else needs to read less.
Well, I think I don't know how far back the view goes, but it's certainly, at least at this point, it's a common view. But if by marrying the first husband, she's being, according to Micah's view, according to this view, she's being exploited. Even if she is in a situation where she's still being provided for financially, she's nonetheless being exploited for having been remarried to the person. If she gets married again to somebody else, she's as far as we know not being exploited. So I guess that's just the point. That's the financial aspect of it that I was trying to point out. But I don't know for sure what the answer is. It just seems to me that the text doesn't say she can't marry again to somebody beyond her first husband.
It's not regulating her activity at all. It's regulating the man's activity.
It's regulating his. That's right.
That's what I wanted to point out. We're using a lot of she's and hers here. The emphasis is on what he can do. So that's what makes me think this is a him thing, not so much a her thing. He cannot go back and try to take her as his wife again. The emphasis is not on what she can do. The emphasis is on what he has done in the past and therefore what he can do in the future. And that's one of the reasons that I think that this is more regulating what the consequences of that husband's decision in the first place.
It's a punishment toward him.
I think it's
Well,
it's at least a consequence.
It's a
It's at least a
regulation
consequence.
for him, not a punishment. I mean, there's
Yeah, it's at least a consequence of his decision in the first place.
I still think that the spiritual reason for it, yes, she could join herself to somebody else, and since they have not previously been joined, that would be a new union. But going back and being joined, particularly to him, even if the second marriage was dissolved by death or any subsequent ones, that still makes the most sense to me. But I appreciate hearing the economic explanation. I feel like that would be. Greg's point, I think you made it very well. I feel like if that was the point, it would be said here that the law has so frequently spoken about that's absence. It seems like something else is going on here. But
Is there any other text you can? Is there any other text you could point to state to, I guess, to prove that it's more defiling inherently for like a union that once was, that is no longer, and then she's been in a union with someone else to go back to that, then like it would be to go on to something else. Like is this the only thing?
This is the main text, at least that we've seen so far. I think that though, as you go on, like I said, I think that remarriage, as we look at what God is intending, just like you talked about before. Okay, we see polygamous relationships, but we all agree that that's not what God's ideal is. What is the ideal for God? I think it's one man, one woman for a life. That's what I think God's ideal is. And so, then there are caveats and explanations and nuances that allow for various, circumstances and different circumstances. But that is the seeming ideal from beginning to end. And I don't think we'll encounter anything after this that will, go against that. And like I said, I think if we keep our eyes open, the strongest language, the strongest rebukes in this passage and anywhere else that we might find them is always for the remarriage, which would then talk about the subsequent joining, and the subsequent joining, and the subsequent joining is making a more complicated spiritual reality about going back to the one flesh principle that they've been joined together. God has joined them together in a way that is not obvious, and it I don't know what the right words are. It goes above and beyond what we would think of as like a civil union or a contract or even a living arrangement. There is a reality in that one flesh statement. I think that means a lot more than we realize.
So, and maybe we can just let it rest after this. But if that is the principle that's underneath this, then doesn't it like that the emphasis being that marriage is something so unique and so spiritually binding, so unifying between a man and a woman, the one flesh union. If that is the case, I mean, assuming the second husband dies, wouldn't it make more sense for her to go back to her original husband, if indeed the one fleshness of the union is what's being emphasized here? But because once again, it doesn't say she can't go on to other people, which is like making more unions. So
I think the despicableness of this is you had this thing, you fractured it, you went off somewhere else. You don't get to rinse, wash, and repeat. Like, again, my reading of the text is very in line with Joe's, and while it might seem better in our sight that you do go back, apparently in that instance for those two individuals there's a defilement, and it's not, and again, if you don't bake into the cake financial exploitation or whatever we want to call it, that's what it seems to say on its face.
Yeah, and let me say too, I want to make it clear that I am certainly not saying, I wouldn't say that it's only about financial exploitation. I believe that, the second marriage is the issue, but as Micah said, based on the reading I've done, a dowry was at the very least involved. But is it limited to that? Is that all that the text is talking about? I wouldn't go that far. But
it'd be very interesting to find out if a second dowry was expected of a father, or subsequent dowries in every situation were expected from this woman's father. And again, it's be talking about, and again, maybe if the defilement wasn't like this isn't good. Like, this isn't right. This isn't moral. And again, probably part of my reading is when I read this as an abomination to God, I'm reading in some moral aspect to that because I want to put it in a moral
I think no
judicial
matter
bucket.
what side you take,
So,
it is still a moral issue. No matter what, even Micah's position is a moral issue. Also, it's not ceremonial.
I suppose that's true.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about this for our whole episode, but we probably should press on into other things. There's an awful lot more in this chapter. And so there are many principles that we could discuss from verses 6 to 22, things like taking pledges for loans, executing kidnappers and slave traders, guarding against leprosy, grumbling against leaders, paying laborers in a timely fashion, people dying for their own sin alone, rather than being put to death for, fathers for sons or sons for fathers, maintaining justice, economic provision for all, lots of different stuff. There are interspersed in here, verse 9, verse 18, verse 22, these statements about God's character and his deeds. Do you guys just have any further thoughts on how God ties his laws and his commandments to his own character and deeds throughout time? Again, for those who think that the law is icky, or who, the large group of Christians, for example, that want to unhitch from the Old Testament, we've certainly talked about some things that we would understand. Okay, I get why people would want to unhitch, but God ties these things to his character, to his deeds and history. So that's why I don't want to unhitch from the Old Testament. Any thoughts that you guys have on any of these principles, or specifically, though, my question is, all these things are seemingly consistent. Like God says, do this stuff because I'm God and because this is how I act. Do you read it differently than that, or any thoughts on that?
If it wasn't tied to some attribute of God or some action of God, or back to God in some way, we would have to make the argument that God's just, arbitrarily plucking these rules out of the void, right? And so if God says this is right, or this is good, or this is just, or this is wise, where else is that coming from besides his character, his nature, his understanding of what's right and just? And so, to me, that's just self-evident and self-obvious. But then you do have to deal with the consequences of, well, okay, if it was right for them, is it not right for us? And then we create buckets and throw different rules into different buckets and decide which ones we still have to follow.
So, verse 13, to kind of illustrate that, you shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. To say that God's commands are just arbitrary, or to say that, I don't know, there's an old view of morality that it's called just the divine fiat view, where there's no necessary connection between God's character and his commands. It's just, he just decides, so almost like superfluously or arbitrarily, this is what's going to be this is just what's going to be the order. There's no necessary connection between his character and the order that he establishes. Well, on that view, you actually have no rooted definition of righteousness. He says, it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God. Well, there's no actual definition of righteousness then. It's not more deeply grounded than simply what God said. If there's no connection between what God says and who he is, it has to be grounded in his character. And that's what I think the moral law is. I think the moral law is a reflection of the divine character. I think it's a reflection of his righteousness.
Yeah, I agree. I think that all the moral laws, as you already said, reflect God's character. Something is right because it's consistent with God's character. Something is wrong because it's inconsistent with God's character. That's the way that I see it. And that makes the moral law absolute because God's nature is absolute and unchanging. And there's something I noticed about this too. And actually, so many other verses came into my mind as I was looking at this. But at other times, God will give a command, and the command is stated in such a way that it's meant to change Israel's perspective. So, for example, in verse 18, Deuteronomy 24:18, he says, "But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing." What's the thing he's commanding them to do? Verse 17, "You shall not pervert the justice due to an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge." So basically what he's saying is, I want you to show compassion, and exercise justice toward aliens. And what will motivate you to do this is remembering that you were in their situation at one time also. You were a foreigner in Egypt. You were a slave in Egypt. And then again, he says something similar in verse 22. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this thing. So why is he commanding him to do this thing? Because they used to be in that situation themselves. So it's almost like by changing your perspective, it in a way changes your heart. If you lack compassion for an alien, or a foreigner, just remember you were a foreigner at one time in the land of Egypt, and that should change your heart toward that person. So if you change your perspective, you can change your heart. At least that can help to change a person's heart. So I just found that interesting. There's dozens and dozens of other examples of this kind of motivation elsewhere in Scripture.
Fair enough. Should we move into chapter 25?
Yeah, I got a question for chapter 25. I'll start us off. If condemned, a wicked man was to be beaten with the number of stripes according to his guilt. That's mentioned in Deuteronomy 25:2. However, the stripes could not exceed 40, or else the man would be degraded. So my question is, what is the meaning of this last statement? Why did going beyond 40 stripes degrade the man? Is this like another example of an arbitrary number, or was there a specific reason for this?
I'm not exactly sure. I think that for some reason, the giving him an excessive amount of lashes, that seems what this seems to be about. Like, excessive amount of lashes would be more shameful than was appropriate for the circumstances, perhaps. Also, I just want to note that, or I guess I want to add in there that isn't this even far more merciful than even the modern prison system is? Like, receiving, you could be, for really heinous offenses, you got put to death. For some other offenses, you had to make restitution. But then there were offenses that you got lashes for, but you didn't spend decades of your life caged up like a dog. Like, if doing more than 40 lashes was excessively shameful, like what is what we do? There's a serious disconnect there.
To me, this seems to be saying, kind of right in line with what Mike is saying. I might just phrase it a little bit differently. There were laws that God gave his people for seriously heinous offenses that were capital punishment. And then there were laws for which he had not established a cap, right? And so here is the cap. If somebody does something, it's not worthy of death, you shall beat them, but not more than 40 times. Now, why 40? Is there some magical, mystical number about 40? I have no idea. It seems to me that going beyond 40, for whatever the case, was a violation or an insult against maybe the image of God in that person. Like, there's, at least not to my recollection, there's no law that says you can't beat your ox more than 40 times, or you can't kick your dog more than 40 times. But maybe you shouldn't. But there wasn't a law prescribing that. Maybe.
You have a conscience?
I'm not a dog person.
Someone needs to check on Greg's animals.
But isn't it funny that we go, well, I think we are less offended by the idea of a person being whipped 40 times or more than we are about someone kicking their dog 40 times or more. Like, it shouldn't, to me, I was being silly, but kick your dog 40 times. Don't hit that person 40 times. But that just shows you our perspective on this, and it is interesting. We laughed at the idea of a dog being kicked.
The level of guilt for a man transgressing, some sort of law, whether it's God's law or man's law, is different than your dog chewing up your newspaper or something like that, and acting as an animal. Dogs are, if you have a dog in your house and it chews up your stuff, it's a dog. That's what it does. So
maybe you should be beaten 40 times.
But not all men need to do these types of crimes that would be that they'd be convicted of and then need to be beaten publicly for. So yeah, I have anyway. All silliness aside, I have no idea why the number 40 is chosen. I have studied this in a little bit more detail fairly recently for different reasons, and was reading some of the other I think it's like in the Mishnah and stuff like the additional explanations and laws and how this practice is done. And this beating was really severe. The number for us, it sounds like whatever, but to be struck up to 40 times is a lot. And this could make grown men defecate on themselves or urinate on themselves. It's such a severe beating. We sometimes say that I'm going to beat the something out of you. Like this literally could. And if that happened, they would stop there. Like they wouldn't, if they said you're supposed to get, usually it had to be divisible by 3 because of where they'd beat you on the body. But if all right, you're going to get the full lashing, you're going to get 39 because we're not going to exceed 40. And you defecate on yourself around 26 or something, they would stop there. And so this idea of not degrading a person, Micah, I think you put it really well. What we do to people is degrading. In fact, it seems like that's almost the purpose, is to degrade people, to make them feel, to make them be something less than human. And it is interesting for all those who think that the Old Testament is so vile. There is an attempt here, whether people like it or not, there is at least, they are attempting to preserve even the dignity of someone who is guilty. And that is a profound statement. Like, do not, even if this person is guilty, they're guilty, but still treat them like a human being. That's an amazing statement to me.
Yeah, and I think if you were to ask most people, you can do 3 years in prison, or you can be beaten 39 times. Yeah, that's severe. Sometimes we skim right over that number. That's like, you ever been in a fist fight? Most of the time you're not getting hit 39 times. The fight's going to end long before that. So that's a lot, but it's not more than 3 years of my life, So and also I want to just contrast how we think about physical pain, punishment. We think any causing of physical pain to somebody is inhumane. Like in the prison system, there's like all sorts of laws about, treatment of prisoners and things like that. And very clear, like, yeah, you might be caging this person up like a dog for decades of their life, but you cannot go out of your way to cause them physical pain. Like, at least the people who are in charge cannot do that, because they have rights. But isn't the biblical picture just the inverse of that? Actually, it would be better and more humane for them to be caused a limited duration of physical pain versus being just treated like an animal for extended periods of time.
Totally agree. I think, well, first of all, the text says that the punishment is to be according to the guilt of the man. So the point was to exercise justice. He's guilty, therefore he deserves a specific punishment. And the punishment was not meant to humiliate or degrade the person. And it sounds to me like the punishment is supposed to be corrective. Like, if you're going to get beat 40 times, which is a pretty significant number, I'll bet you the guy will think twice before he does that crime again. If I'm going to get beat 40 times, I'm going to be going, man, I probably don't want to do that again, because I'm going to get my butt kicked. It's going to be pretty bad. So I like what you said, Micah. I think it's, in one sense, like, this is way better than rotting in a cell for years and not changing at all. Matter of fact, the recidivism rate for prisoners is sky high, which means when people go to prison, it's very likely they're going to go back at some point in the future. Prison does not usually rehabilitate people. It oftentimes makes them worse. But if you get beat with a rod 40 times, I'll bet you're going to be, if not rehabilitated, awfully close to it. So I think that this actually is a more humane, a more reasonable, and a more just punishment.
So I also want to note that, if you were going to try to apply this in modern society, it's necessary to have the broader application of the death penalty that they had under this legal code, because there are some offenses that you're like, well, that deserves way more than just the lashes. But we're uncomfortable with the death penalty. So
not even
like,
a death penalty, but an expedited death penalty. Like there wasn't decades of waiting.
Correct. So if this kind of system was going to be, if this kind of punishment was going to disincentivize the behavior that it was aimed at disincentivizing, there also has to be a broader application and a quicker execution of the death penalty for the crimes that are truly heinous, that in our culture we kind of just shrug our shoulders at them and do 25 years in prison and then get released or whatever. Or no, like the death penalty applies to more things in this culture. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily everything that the Old Testament says death penalty for is necessary in all cultures, but what I am saying is that broader and quicker execution of the death penalty makes punishments like this more feasible.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
There certainly is evidence that cultures that have codes that are closer to this, and of course, people object about all those things. But all those objections aside, when you have more severe and swift punishments like these, you do tend to have, to the best of my knowledge, less occurrences of these. They are actually, there is a very strong, not only redemptive thing to this for those who are guilty, but also a warning against bad behavior. And we've talked about this just like with the eye for eye principle, or we talked about it with the putting to death of your own child, right? I mean, at what age would you do this? I don't think the intention is ever to do that. I think the intention of this is you don't want to beat anybody, period. But trying to maintain dignity, but also putting in these severe penalties showed that this was a society that was serious about saying you're going to honor these laws, and violations of these laws, you're not just getting a little slap on the wrist. It is all of us, if you were given a choice between these two things, maybe some people would take 3 years. I'm with you. I would rather take the public beating, but let me be clear. I don't want the public beating. So I'd rather just not do the thing in the first place and not have my freedom taken away or be beaten publicly with the risk that I might, urinate all over myself in front of a bunch of people because you beat me until I'm, to that state. Like that is, I'd rather just not take your stuff. Doesn't that just
stop
seem better?
breaking the law?
Yeah.
I defecate early and get out of it.
My goodness.
He'd eat a burrito.
Like, hold
before
on.
work.
He has no shame.
No shame in my game. No.
Greg, you ready? No, let me finish this burrito. I got some extra hot sauce on it. Oh, brother.
All right. Well, let's move on to
Thank
a question that's designed to get me a demerit. And so I'll just take my demerit before I even ask the question. So I've got one. Verse 4, you shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing. Based upon our hermeneutics so far, is this about the ox? And what if we were to read somewhere later, perhaps the New Testament, where Paul says, like, God's not worried about, he wasn't concerned about the ox, was he? This wasn't really about the ox. What should that do to our hermeneutic? Do we share Paul's hermeneutic on this? Thoughts about this specifically as it's dealt with later?
I have a thought, and the thought is, Joe has been so lax with demerits that you have been emboldened to.
No,
this is the first one I've gotten in this discussion,
and he took it.
That's true.
He took it.
You have exercised an incredible amount of self-restraint.
He took it with the same eagerness with
absolutely
which he would
commend
eat that burrito. So
Notice the context. The context is, it's in a context talking about justice. Now, it's a different kind of justice that's in view. I don't think it's about the ox. I don't think that it's about the muzzling of the ox. I think that's a manifestation of the principle, and the principle is thou shalt not steal. Don't steal from people what you owe to them. That's what I think the moral principle is.
So
underneath
if that's the case,
and I will I will not go to the texts that I want to go to.
I'm not asking you.
Dangling
If that's the case, if this isn't about the ox, what does that do to how we read everything else that we've read in chapter 24, what we're reading in chapter 25? Like, if it's not about the ox,
are you looking for permission to spiritualize everything, Greg? Is that what?
No, I'm really not. I think I'm asking an honest hermeneutical question.
I think this is about the ox. And I think that should we read later texts that takes the principle that's underlying this law, which is about the ox, we can argue. Rabbis did this a lot. I think we'll see other people. If something is true in a lesser case, it's also true in a greater case. And so, you already said it. If Paul should say something like God's not really concerned about oxen, is he? Well, the law is about oxen. That is what it's about. But isn't God more concerned about human beings? And so if we would enact this principle and treat our animals with this respect and with this dignity, but now you think that we don't have to treat human beings with this respect or dignity, you've completely missed the point. And so it's not saying that this isn't about oxen, full stop, and it's really about people, but, and now we have to have some spiritual underlying principle, understanding that when he says ox, he means people, and now we got to get our decoder rings out or something like that. So I'm glad that that's not what you're trying to do. But I don't think that, this later principle here, as we read this, yes, this is about oxen, but the principle of treating even your animals with this kind of dignity, if it applies to animals, of course it should also apply to human beings. And so if you're going to try and live by the spirit of the law, how dare you treat your animals with dignity and your neighbor without it? How dare you, you're going to make sure that your animal is provided for, but you're going to rob from a human being. This would be a complete misunderstanding of the law in general. And I don't think that, later things that we'll read is Paul saying, this wasn't about ox. If you were spiritual, you'd know this is really about people. I think he's doing, if it was true about oxen, and God's not even really all that concerned about oxen, isn't it much more true about people whom God is very much concerned about?
Right. There's a if this, then definitely that idea here. I think it was. I'm glad you said that, Joe, because I didn't want to be the first one to say that it was about the ox. I actually Joe took the bullet for me. I think it is about the ox, but I don't think it's only about the ox. I think when I think what Paul said was, or at least I think this is what he meant. I think he meant it's not only about the ox.
Well, I'm glad I got Micah to fall into the trap. So at least one.
So I was being a little bit hyperbolic in my answer. Ultimately, I was speaking in ultimate terms. It's not so about the ox that I think that if I were, once again, put myself in the modern day situation here, and I'm trying to plow a field. Let's say I'm Amish or something, and I'm plowing a field with oxen and donkeys and whatever. Do I think that it's necessarily immoral for everybody in every culture at all times, if they put a muzzle on their ox? No, I think that they were told not to because God wanted to demonstrate a moral principle to them that wasn't only about the oxen. Absolutely. So it is about the oxen. It's not ultimately about the oxen. Paul makes it clear that this is ultimately about principles of pay somebody what you owe them. Don't steal from them. That's my position on it.
So then you're saying that dependent upon the culture, it might be okay to not allow the ox to eat while threshing.
Yeah, I don't think there's any moral imperative on other cultures to not muzzle their oxen. Just like there's not any moral imperative not to use a donkey and an oxen at the same time while they plow.
Because this is a positive law. Is that the word you use? Yeah,
it's a positive law, which once again are concrete, time and space bound, culture bound applications of moral law principles.
And again, how do you know in this instance that this, which will be expounded upon, opened up, given greater understanding later, how do you know that this is positive law?
Well, because it's not one of the 10 commandments.
So only the 10 commandments are moral law?
The 10 Commandments are a comprehensive summary of the moral law of God or of natural law. And then the other laws that you see, whether they're, I know you don't like the buckets, but civil.
No. I'm asking you to use the buckets right now.
Yeah. Civil or ceremonial, those are, once again, they're applications of moral law principles that are for this specific people at this specific time. So if something if something is not directly one of the, directly related to one of the 10 commandments or necessarily related to one of the 10 commandments, then it will be in the positive law category.
If this was an outworking of one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not steal, and the implication is they shouldn't steal from their animals, then in which case, why would it be okay to muzzle an ox in a different, if ultimately this is simply an application of of the moral law that thou shalt not steal.
And in
Because the second-
chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, you very creatively brought that back to a moral law and said, look, this is always the case. Why couldn't you do the same thing here? Or why shouldn't you do the same thing
because
here?
the second table of the moral law has to do with how you treat image bearers of God primarily. So I think this is a concrete. So I think this is an expression of that moral law principle. But once again, it's not ultimately about the ox. Now, would it have been wrong for somebody in this culture to muzzle their ox? Yes, because God told you not to do it because he's trying to teach you a lesson through this positive law. But the second table of the moral law of God has to do with how image bearers relate to image bearers. And so I would put this in the positive law bucket.
May I suggest you jump through a lot of hoops and do a lot of gymnastics to get to what is or isn't sometimes?
I do a lot of natural exegesis.
Maybe unnatural exegesis.
That was a good answer, though. Yeah.
All right. Oh, okay. I got the next question. So we read, starting at verse 5, going through verse 10, about this law that says that if your brother dies and he's married, you've got to take his wife as a spouse. But if you refuse to, there's some consequences. She gets to spit in your face. She gets to take your sandal, and you get to be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Could you imagine a situation where you might go, "Hey, I think I'll take that," as opposed to marrying my brother's wife? Thoughts about this rule?
Can I respond to your question with a question?
My permission's never stopped you in the past.
You ought to ask me upon what basis do I have for saying I don't think there's anything in the modern era or other nations that keep you from muzzling an ox while treading out the grain.
I'm sorry. I'm not asking you if this applies today. I'm asking you to put yourself in that situation, that time. Let's say this law applied to you. Could you imagine a situation where you go, I'd rather be spit on than be married to this one?
I'm sidestepping your question and I'm being contentious.
Well, I'm going to continue to ignore you.
So the levirate marriage is another good example. Do you think there's any enduring moral responsibility to engage in this kind of thing? Or do you consider this as what I would call positive law? And if so, what hermeneutical basis do you have for considering it to be such?
So you're just going to completely ignore the question I asked and not let us move on.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're getting the ground rules right. Well, then I'm going to ignore you and ask the question again. No, Mike, I've never thought about this. I would have to deal with how. Yeah, I'd have to deal with that. I haven't dealt with it. Haven't thought about it. Haven't considered it yet.
I appreciate the honest answer.
It does help in this particular case, or at least it would be a powerful exegetical device. Certainly just the purpose of these people being set apart, the purpose of bringing forth God's promise, the clear explanation that God has given in his desire to preserve the inheritances. All these laws make sense for that, and that doesn't seem to be as important in other places where we're expecting some sort of promised seed to come and crush the head of the serpent from a very particular lineage in a very particular, geographical location or whatever. So these things do seem to go along with that purpose. And yeah, if you're not going to enact this law, can I envision a scenario? Well, I mean, there must be one because they're giving you a choice. Do you either want to do this thing or do this other thing? And which of these is more icky to you? Would you rather have your face be spit in public and have your sandal removed and have your reputation be the one?
I could see a situation where I'd go ahead and sign up for that.
There's certain situations where the society would go, I get it.
Yes, exactly. Well chosen, brother.
I don't blame you.
No, to the point about listen, positive law, moral, civil, I get it. It has utility. And I'm not saying we should completely abandon it. That's not my argument. My argument is just trying to, instead of blindly, with great ease and abandonment, maybe throwing things in here. I just want to, and again, I would never bring this up in a Sunday school class. I'd never, this wouldn't be part of my normal conversation. I'm having a conversation with 3 guys who I think are thinking about these things deeply. And so, hey, while we're thinking about these things deeply, let's think about this deeply, and let's ask ourselves good questions. If we're going to say that chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 is moral because it has to do with stealing, okay, fine. Why isn't verse 4 of chapter 5 moral because it has to do with stealing? And if we ultimately have to settle somewhere, great, let's settle somewhere. But I only want to settle somewhere after I've thought deeply and considered my hermeneutic, not just it's my hermeneutic, and so that's why I'm going to do it. I want to slow down and be thoughtful.
Are we still talking about the ox?
No, we're not talking about the ox, but okay, now we can talk about what I would do. Because I really quickly would want to go, yeah, I'm not under the Levitical, I have no Levitical responsibility to uphold it because the law and the priesthood of the Levite has passed, and so yay that I don't have to marry my brother's wife. Yay.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I think the context makes it pretty clear that this is Israel specific. This is, Old Covenant specific, the marrying your sister-in-law.
And I completely agree with you. But instead of just saying it's obvious to me, I want to be able to say why it's obvious to me.
And here's why it is to me. And I get what you're saying. I agree with everything that you just said. So in verse 6, it says, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. And then verse 10 says, in Israel, his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. It seems to be Israel specific here. And of course, we all know, like, you marry within your tribe, and there's very good reasons for that, keeping the tribal identity, of people. So, there's, your questions are definitely valid. I certainly am not, I wouldn't want to dismiss them. In this case, I think it's...
Yeah. And as we're sitting here, I'm only pushing back as hard as I'm pushing back against our buckets because nobody else is pushing back. So if somebody else were, I'd probably be coming to a little bit more neutral position. And so I'm being as contentious as I am because I think somebody ought to be contentious about this, not necessarily because I have these burning feelings about it. I just think it's worthy of consideration and worthy of careful consideration.
You don't share Micah's, and unfortunately his internet dropped out, so he's not here to speak for himself, but I'll ask you. You don't share his positive law formulation and exegetical practice, but you would agree that this is not something that applies. So how do you arrive at that? Eric explained why he arrived where he does.
I think Eric's explanation is really good. Like, I don't, I'm not maintaining this familial line that's meant to bring about some future king or something promised in Genesis 3. I'm not under the Levitical priesthood. And so that Levitical obligation isn't there. Now, I would say something like this. I'm not going to say that. I'd want to consider it more deeply. But yes, so for the reasons Eric said, the expectations, the purpose behind this, I'm not working to fulfill that purpose, and God hasn't placed that purpose on me. And so, yeah. Now, is there some principle there that we should understand? We could definitely talk about that.
Well, I have a related question. Perhaps this will get us into the principle. Maybe, maybe not. But we've read already prohibitions against this. That you shall not take your brother's wife, and now here is a command to take your brother's wife under very certain circumstances. Is this a contradiction, or how can we have both of this? One thing seems to be abhorrent to the Lord, should not be practiced in Israel, but now is saying, well, if your brother dies, though, then you do this thing that. How do we understand how these work together?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult for me to not jump ahead as I think about this. But what we can say is prior to this instruction, this specific set of circumstances, uncovering the nakedness of your brother's wife was uncovering your brother's nakedness. Well, your brother is now dead. She is now no longer his wife because he's dead, but now you have this obligation to continue his name in Israel. And so it's only justifiable, it's only right because your brother is now passed. So it's not a contradiction as I read it.
I totally agree. One verse is talking about the brother still being alive. The other verse is talking about the brother being dead. If he's dead, marriage to his the wife can, or the widow can marry his brother because he's not in the picture anymore. So I think that's just clear.
Yeah. As with most of the things that we talk about that people think are contradictory, that they almost always fail to recognize that this is not talking about the same thing and in the same sense. And so the previous prohibitions, although they involve the same individuals, are not talking at all about the same thing. And so this is not, this certainly isn't a contradiction to those other things. So I'm in full agreement with you guys. Another question for later on in this chapter, in Deuteronomy 25, starting at verse 13, it talks about a prohibition against having differing sized weights, having full and just weights. But then here is this idea of it's an abomination to not do this. And so, Greg, you've rightly said that things that are an abomination to the Lord, that should catch our attention. There's a lot of things that people discuss from the Old Testament that they say, oh, this is an abomination. This isn't one that gets as much discussion. So what's going on here? What is the principle here? Why is this so abominable to God to have these unjust weights or differing weights? What is even being described here?
Well, I'm not entirely sure how all of this worked, but whatever this is referring to, it was unjust. And I do know, based on the little bit of reading I've done, in ancient times, trade was conducted using weights. So using unjust weights would result in basically exploiting customers, taking advantage of them, essentially stealing from them. So this was a violation of God's command in Exodus 20:15 to not steal. If you had unjust weights, you were manipulating the situation for financial gain, and you were taking advantage of people. So this was a very serious crime. This is repeated over and over again in Scripture, and God has very, very harsh words for this. So it sounds on the surface like, well, it's bad, but it's not the worst thing you could do. God speaks of it as very, very severe, and the punishment was, maybe more than what someone might think.
Yeah, whether this tied directly back to stealing or whether it tied back to providing honest, true testimony, I guess I'm not going to say one way or the other, but justice, rightness, it surely ties back to those principles, and those principles that are characteristics of God. God is just. He is not arbitrary. He's not capricious. He's dealing out righteously, and as people of God, the Israelites were commanded and expected to deal righteously. And so I think this is another example of don't do this, because doing it is an unrighteous act. It's an unjust act. And so here is another example of how you are to exercise righteousness.
I understand it the same as you guys, so I don't have anything to add.
I think Micah was so scared his internet had cut out. He just hit the eject button, and
no, he's definitely having connectivity issues. It's confirmed by our recording software. We knew he was having some problems, so glad he was able to stick with us. He might join us again, but we can move into the last chapter without him, I guess.
I have a question for chapter 26, and it says, this is verses 5 through 10 I'm talking about. After giving the priest his first fruits, an Israelite was required to recite the words mentioned in verses 5 through 10. So what was the purpose of reciting these words? It was almost like he had to, recall Israel's history, recall his own history. So what was the point of reciting those words?
I can imagine a situation where, you're required to show up and give these things, and it could just become mechanistic. It could just become tradition. It could just become what you do. And so as I read this, the obligation to recall to mind and even say it out loud, like, I'm doing this, remembering the situation that my fathers came out of. It personalizes this. It makes it real to you. It's a safeguard against this repetitive, tradition-based, not connected to any emotion or reality that you might feel. And so it personalizes this as opposed to what we might do with it otherwise.
I think that's well said. I'm reminded I once was witnessing to a guy, and he said, "What do I need God for? God hasn't done anything for me. I've done everything myself. He hasn't helped me at all." I was like, "Oh, God didn't give you blood in your veins and air for you to breathe, and give you your brain so you could think, and give you working limbs so you could walk around, and he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything for you, huh?" The guy got really upset with me, but the idea that he could think that he could take all these things that God had given him and then none of that mattered. I think a recitation like this is just an acknowledgement. God, this wasn't our land, but you brought us in, and you've produced. And yeah, I might have worked for this. I might have, plowed my fields and sowed them with seed and been patient and harvest them at the right time. But God, you've made all this possible, and you've produced these things. And yeah, of course, it can become rote. But it's a similar thing to why pray for your food, right? Thanking God for His provision, and blessing. Of course, you can get into a rote thing.
Rub-a-dub-dub,
I don't know.
Thanks for the grub.
Yeah, I mean, there's no. Our hearts can, of course, become hardened by repetitious process of just going through the motions. But if you don't do this at all, there's a danger on that other side. That's the other ditch, right? That you don't acknowledge. You just begin to think. And God warned them about that. When you go into the land, don't ever forget that I'm the one who has given this to you, that I've provided. When there's abundance, it's really easy to forget the Lord. And so by saying something like this, it is at least an acknowledgement. And hopefully they don't just do it by rote. Hopefully they really mean it. But the danger of just not saying anything is an equal, perhaps maybe even a greater danger of just forgetting to acknowledge that the Lord is always involved in whatever provision that we have. And it sure does seem to me, I know, Greg, you've talked about this in other contexts, but I've appreciated this just in our relationship as we've walked serving the Lord together. Having an attitude of thankfulness, of rejoicing in the goodness of God, of thanking Him for what He's done, that's a good posture to maintain just as a general thing. And this seems tied to that. We talked about a similar thing with the festivals. Like, you shouldn't be begrudging. Oh, I got to take time off work and go to the thing. Like, it's a fest. It's time to celebrate God's abundant provision and His goodness. And this likewise, I don't think this was just intended to be some sort of robotic prayer. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there. Like, this is supposed to be something that is, God, we were slaves. We were wandering in the wilderness, and you've brought us to this abundant land. Look at what you've produced. Look at what you've allowed us to participate in. Thank you for your abundant provision for us. I think that's the intent.
And a modern application of this could look like communion, right? There is a way in which you and I could gather at the Lord's table, and it's what we do every first Sunday of the month, and we just go through the motions, or we can do it purposefully, joyfully, solemnly, maybe, but not losing the significance. Or we could fail to do communion, not do it at all, or we could fall in the ditch, right? So yeah, two ditches there, as always. Let's not spend our time in the ditch.
Yeah, and sometimes even if let's say your heart is not in it, I'm talking about the command in Deuteronomy here. Even if your heart is not in it, by just simply reciting the words, sometimes even if it starts in a kind of mechanistic way, as you're saying these things, you're like, man, God did all that. And it could almost jumpstart your excitement and your emotions and your thankfulness.
I'd say that's the design of it almost, right? Like that,
yeah.
This is a help. This is
right.
In a positive way, this is a crutch for you.
Ideally, they should have this attitude going into this.
Yes.
But even if they didn't, just saying these things like, oh my goodness, like the only reason we even are in this land is because God brought us here. We defeated impossible enemies, and God's given us all these blessings. So I think there's something about just, I'm thinking of other verses that I can't quote, but just by reminding yourself sometimes of what God has done and God's goodness, that can ignite something in you that wasn't there before, just by simply saying it. I'm not talking about like positive words or something, but what God's actually done and what He's actually said.
That's an argument, and I've done it in the past. I'm not currently doing it, but like a prayer journal, right? Being, writing those things down, not necessarily for the act of writing them down, but for the ability to go back and like, oh, God, I answered that prayer, I did that prayer.
Oh, sure.
And so that's a benefit. It's been a beneficial spiritual practice for me in the past.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well said. Well, doesn't seem like Mike is going to be able to join us again. I think that was the last question we had, unless you guys have anything else that sprang to mind while we were talking, but doesn't look like it. Well, that's going to be our show for today. Micah, if you're watching this now after it's been posted, we'd love to hear your comments. If you had other things to say, you could write them down instead of saying them. Or if you're watching this and you're not Micah, which hopefully is most of you, then you could also comment down below. You could click the thumbs up or the share button or the thumbs down button if you hate our dumb faces. Whatever it is that you want to do. Again, until we see you again, we hope that you will get equipped, you will obey your King, and you will glorify your God.
Are we still talking about the ox?
Maybe.